VR FPS games are incredible. They provide a shooter experience like nothing else, but unfortunately, the PvP side of this genre has stagnated. This is surprising, considering that competitive FPS games on PC are extremely popular, but it doesn't seem like that's carried over to virtual reality. This genre hasn't really grown in the last 2 years. The main thing keeping these games alive right now is community-made modded content. As someone involved in game development, I want to know why this genre hasn't grown or developed that much, and I want to understand the problems and decision-making that's brought us to this point. Maybe then we can find a solution, one that's probably a lot simpler than most of you realize. So join me on this dive into the VR PvP shooter genre. It's gonna take a while to unwrap, so sit back and enjoy. Our journey starts about 3 weeks ago. I knew I wanted to make some type of VR shooter video, so I hopped on the only one I knew at the time, and that's Onward. And this is the OG of VR shooters. It released all the way back in 2016. This game mainly focuses on realistic and tactical gameplay. The guns feel good, the controls are nice, and I still feel like this game has the best inventory layout of all the other shooters we're going to talk about today. The recoil is pretty simple, at least if you have a foregrip attachment on your gun, which you almost always will. The gun just kinda goes up a little. Kinda like how Tarkov does recoil almost, but in VR. The time to kill in this game is extremely quick. You get shot twice by pretty much anything that isn't a pistol, and you are dead. With the really low recoil, it's not that hard to hit those 2 shots either, so usually it comes down to whoever sees the other person first and whoever reacts faster. For a realistic tactical shooter, this is good. Here's where the problems start though. The movement in this game is pretty rough. You know how in PC FPS games your sideways strafe speed is a lot slower typically than your forward movement speed? Well, in Onward, those 2 speeds are almost the exact same. The movement just looks kinda basic. You got that VR slide, you know? There isn't any momentum, the character kinda just starts moving in one direction whenever you want it to. But hey, whatever, the movement's fine, and considering this is one of the first PvP VR shooters, I don't expect it to be extremely detailed. The 2 main things that actually keep me from playing this game is the maps and the game modes. First, the game modes. There are really only 2 main PvP game modes that are actually populated, and that's Gun Game and Uplink. You guys already know what Gun Game is. It's a pretty fun party game, but that really isn't Onward's strong suit compared to the games we're going to be talking about later. Uplink is kind of like Bomb from CSGO, except with only 1 bomb site. You go to the uplink, enter in a code, and as long as the defenders of the team don't enter in the same code, you win. Pretty basic stuff. The lack of variety isn't too bad if the maps are very different, but here's the second problem, and that's the maps. Most of the maps are very open. There isn't much cover, and they're full of long lanes. Considering that the movement speed's kinda slow, how quick you can die, how low the recoil is, this lack of cover can be seriously annoying if you're actually trying to push somewhere. There is one CQB map, but because footsteps are extremely loud in this game, you know where exactly everybody else is relative to you. So gameplay on these CQB maps devolve into people either sprinting around, just winning fights based on reaction time, who shoots the other person first, or somebody sits in a corner waiting for somebody to walk in front of them. That's at least how it's gone in my experience. So that's Onward. You can imagine how playing this game for 4 years kinda gets old after a while. It's a fine game, and it actually has an active competitive community, but in my opinion, the maps, the movements, and the game modes are just kinda basic. Which is a shame because a tactical VR shooter has lots of potential. I feel like this game would do a lot better if it focused more on its CQB aspects, instead of doing these long outdoor maps. Slow down the movement even more, give characters momentum, and make it so you can actually move around without being heard. The best way I could describe Onward right now isn't exactly tactical, it's just more restrictive in the way that you can play. If you join a lobby, you're going to see people choosing the same 2 or 3 maps over and over again, with the same couple game modes, pretty much playing the same way every time. And that's been my experience with Onward. Maybe yours has been different, but I wanted something that allowed for a bit more variety in the gameplay, and maybe not something so hardcore. And that's when I picked up Pavlov. What the fuck? Now Pavlov is the exact opposite in a lot of ways to Onward, for better or worse. It's a much more casual game. If you look in the server browser, you're going to see that most of the populated servers are pretty much party modes like Trouble in Terrace Town or big simple matches of TDM. The gunplay is extremely different from Onward 2. The time to kill in Pavlov is very high and the recoil is extremely high. Oh my god, the recoil. More on that in a minute. The cool part about Pavlov is that it's kind of just casual fun. One of my first experiences was me joining a TDM lobby and immediately saw that the entire enemy team was modeled after John Wick for some reason, so naturally I proceeded to hit jumping no scopes with a 50 cal. One of the most interesting things with Pavlov though, you might have already noticed, is the modding. In Onward, the only mods that I saw were custom maps, and I really only saw that once. It was still the same old Onward gameplay and game modes just on Nuketown for some reason. But in Pavlov, you can have some crazy mods, like Escape From Pavlov. Alright, so basically imagine a knockoff Roblox Escape From Tarkov server, but in VR. Actually, I think Roblox has better looking custom maps than this, but still, it is what it says it is, and it's a really fun game mode. You join a server, get in the map, loot for some money, find some guns, shoot people and zombies for some reason, and then extract. The variety in gameplay that you get in Pavlov is night and day compared to Onward, and I think that's why Pavlov ends up being the more populated of the two games, despite having much worse core gunplay in my opinion. And yes, this is the part where I rant about the guns. My god, does the recoil feel terrible. Making good recoil in a VR game is kind of weird fundamentally since you aren't actually holding on to anything, you're just holding your hands up in the air. So when the virtual reality gun recoils, it's always going to be kind of floaty and weird. And I think this is why games like Onward have pretty much no recoil at all. It gets around this issue. But Pavlov says fuck that, take the recoil patterns of CSGO and port it over to VR. Surely if it works on PC, it'll work in VR, right? On paper, this sort of recoil makes sense, especially on PC games where recoil moves your camera, but in VR, the gun just kind of floats away from your hands. When I'm shooting an AK in Pavlov, by the time I'm even 5 to 7 bullets in, my actual hand in real life is floating about like 2 to 3 inches below where the VR gun is positioned. That whole hand-eye coordination thing, it's not really there anymore, since I don't know exactly where my hand is in relation to the gun. The gun is just kind of doing its own thing now. I don't really know the correct way to simulate recoil in VR. Probably isn't a correct way. But this ain't it. What I ended up doing is just setting the AK to semi and tapping heads. Because headshots are almost usually an instant kill. And that's a lot better than the 6 to 7 bullets it takes to kill somebody in the chest. I'm sure some people like the recoil in this game, good on you, but personally it's always confused me. For a game that's become a casual party game, having super hardcore recoil and high time to kill just seems out of place. Oh, and the movement has all the same problems that Onward's movement has. I think the modding is really what carries this game, but still, the core limitations of the game itself are always going to be there, even when playing a crazy mod like Escape From Pavlov. It still kind of felt like I was in a TDM lobby, just with some extra steps. Still though, I've never played a VR shooter with so much modding potential before I played this game, and there really is some cool stuff that you can do. Escape From Pavlov might be super scuffed, but it's a glimpse into the future of what this genre might end up looking like.
Hey bro.
What up? Hey, that's my shit. Nice. But what if there was a game with even more modding potential than Pavlov? And that's where we talk about Contractors VR. My first experience with Contractors I actually recorded, and well, it's not what you're expecting, I think. So yeah, Contractors is on a whole new level when it comes to modding, it seems like. There are a few things that still carry over from the base game. Every match I played has been on this one game mode. It's basically domination. I think they call it ground war. Not exactly sure what it's called in Contractors, but you go to a point and capture it. Personally, I think this game mode functions better than any of Pavlov's and Onward's game modes. It's simple and it works well for modded games like this. When playing the Clone Wars mod, it really kinda did feel like I was playing some new Clone Wars game. I'm not sure if that's because I haven't played Contractors before, but it was pretty cool. It was kinda weird not having any scopes for the weapons, but that just kind of added to the novelty of it all. The Halo mod was pretty rad too. I don't feel like it's as smooth or polished as the Clone Wars one, mainly because all the weapons have hip-fire reticles, which is kinda hard to get used to in VR. Still, these mods have only been created just a few weeks after Contractors updated to make this all possible, so I'm excited to see what other cool mods get made in the future. But what about the base Contractors game though? Well, honestly I'm not a fan. I don't think I would have played this game very much if it wasn't for the modding. First, one of the most important things for any VR shooter is the weapons. And I really like the recoil. They found a good balance between weapons having significant recoil, but not still as crazy as Pavlov. But the actual weapon handling is... it's weird. I'll let my in-game self explain what I mean. So here we are in Contractors. This is the Brand 805. This is the only gun people use in PvP because it has like no recoil, which kind of sucks. There's like no variety there. But anyways, the reason the weapon handling is kind of weird is because the way Contractors attaches the VR controller to the weapon is at the very top of the controller. That's where the attachment point is. And what that does in practice is, if you rotate your hand forward or backwards, it makes a huge difference in the actual angle of the weapon. Half the time when I aim, usually I hold my hand at a 45-degree angle. That's just where my muscle memory is. It's not going to change for this game, and it probably won't change unless I put many hours in. But what that does is that when I go to aim, I'm always looking down. Constantly, this is happening in PvP. I go to shoot somebody, and then I have to find my reticle, and then I'm already dead, because they're playing on Oculus controllers, which are tiny, and they probably have better attachment points. So it's really kept me from playing the base game, because I have to fight with the reticle half the time. And just to show you how much it actually affects your point of aim, I'm just going to ADS like normal, and then rotate my hand back and forth, and, I mean, look at that. That's absurd. This isn't like huge changes too, I'm literally just doing this. That's it. So here we are in Onward. We're gonna try the same thing, moving back and forth, and yeah, Onward doesn't give a shit how you hold their guns. That's because they mount the guns right in the middle of your hand. So it doesn't matter how I rotate it, the gun's gonna be pretty much in the same exact spot. There's a little bit of movement, but I mean, I'm going all the way back and forth. So because Onward mounts their guns like this, it makes it very easy to quickly ADS and actually get a sight picture. So I can do stuff like this. And the movement is pretty much the exact same thing you'll find in Pavlov and Onward. The animations look a lot better, but the ADS speed is still super slow, so gameplay is sprinting around and then you see somebody and then it's just reaction time who can aim quicker. Maybe I would have liked this sort of gameplay if aiming down sights wasn't really odd, but I feel like if the ADS movement speed was just a bit higher, you'd have a bit more options in combat than just sprinting around and shooting the first person you see. One of the main problems I have with this game though, is that I don't think there's actually an anti-cheat. I've tried looking online and I haven't found any information on it. The only thing I found is a short Steam post by Caveman Studios, the developers of Contractors, saying that they added a kick function to deal with cheaters. Yeah, no, not the best solution. For those unaware, there absolutely are cheaters in VR FPS games. I've encountered them personally on Onward and Pavlov, and those games actually have anti-cheat. So you can imagine how not having anti-cheat will make your game pretty damn attractive to cheaters, especially now that Contractors is having a huge player count boost due to the current modding community boom that's experiencing. Now, I don't really think anybody's making cheats for Contractors, but it still just kinda gets in your head. The few rounds of the base game that I've played before making this video had the same two guys killing me over and over again. One of them didn't even have a set up Steam account, it obviously looked like an alt. They had set their player models to be as small as possible to make themselves harder to shoot, and they would just W key around the map, instantly headshotting anybody in front of them most of the time. And I think they were just really good at the game. I know there's a lot of really skilled people in VR PvP shooters, but the fact that this game doesn't have anti-cheat doesn't leave me with a lot of confidence, and I'm left just second guessing myself. Are they cheating? I don't know. There isn't anything stopping them from installing ESP. Nobody would really know that they're cheating because it's a lot harder to tell if people are cheating in VR, especially if they're being sneaky about it. So it's just kind of demoralizing, especially when you're trying to get into this game for the first time. I want to know that people are killing me are legitimate. Right. So that's Contractors, a game with amazing modding potential, but it still has some basic problems, like a lack of anti-cheat, and the weapon handling's just kind of weird. These are two things that are kind of required to be right for any VR PvP shooter. Alrighty, let's take a step back now and talk a big picture. We have Onward, a hardcore tactical shooter with restrictive but good gameplay. We have Pavlov with a decent modding community, laid back and casual lobbies, but kind of weird gunplay. And then we have Contractors with amazing modding potential, but with some core problems and some also kind of weird weapon handling. The only other VR PvP shooter games that I know of are Veil, which is in closed testing, so I can't play it. Very sad. And Population 1, which is basically Fortnite in VR. And depending on the time of the day, Population 1 might literally be Population 1, which is kind of unfortunate, and that's a big reason why I haven't tried it, at least just for this video, outside of it being, VR Fortnite. But that's it. These are the only populated PvP VR shooters out there that you can play right now. Could you imagine if the only PC shooters you could play were Insurgency, scuffed CSGO, and modded COD lobbies? I mean, sure, it's pretty damn fun for a while, but is it going to be fun for 4 years? I don't know. I feel like there's a lot of wasted potential here. These 3 games are good, and I have a lot of respect for the people that developed them all. I know I'm being hard on them, but seriously, they're all pretty good games. I don't blame them for making their games a little simple to be playable by the largest audience. They kinda have to. VR headsets are expensive and not many people have them. So if you want to make a financially successful VR game, you have to make it playable on almost all of the available systems, including the ones that don't really run games as well. You can see this happening in real time. Games like Onward have actually downgraded their graphics to make it playable on Oculus systems. I do remember this game looking a lot better, and apparently that's why. And from what I've heard, the Pavlov devs have pretty much stopped working on the PC VR version of their game to focus on the larger Oculus population. Not really sure about the validity of that, but I really wouldn't be surprised, and I honestly don't blame them. I think that all of this, combined with COVID, has really hindered the development of these 3 games, and probably any other VR PvP shooters in the works. The VR space is pretty much dominated by small game studios, and all 3 of these games come from pretty small teams. So, let's try to put ourselves into the shoes of these developers to get a better understanding of the climate here. You want to make a cool and complicated shooter, but because of the hardware limitations of headsets like the Quest, doing that can be kind of difficult. COVID has also complicated things for the last 2 years, maybe slowing things down for certain studios. You still have to find a way to compete with other games in the genre too, especially considering that these 3 games are actually very similar in paper. The setting is the same, the game modes are pretty similar, so you need to do something distinct from the others if you actually want to sell your game. So what do? Well, it seems the answer, at least for Pavlov and Contractors, is to open the game up for community-made content. As a developer, you can't just go and add Star Wars and Halo stuff into your game without getting sued into oblivion. But your community can. These aren't big development teams, and they sometimes are limited in what they can do. But the modding community is much larger, and because of that, they can make content faster than any of these studios can. They also don't really have to follow the same rules that game developers do. And I think that's the strategy for these 2 games going forward. For Onward, I'm not really sure what they're doing at this point. They have custom maps now, but outside of that, the game is almost the exact same when I played it 4 years ago. In some ways, it's actually worse than when I played it 4 years ago. I love this game, but unless they add some new content or more community-driven content, I'm afraid it might lose what's left of its already dwindling player base. So that's the direction that pretty much the entire genre is heading right now. It's becoming more dependent on community-driven content to keep people interested in these games. And here's the problem I see with that. Modded content is super cool, but it's always going to be limited in scope by the base game. You can't have any sort of progression, at least not any progression that stays after you leave the lobby. Any problems that are present in the base game can carry over to these modded lobbies, like the lack of anti-cheat, or weird movement, and weird recoil, weird weapon handling, all that stuff. And it's extremely difficult to make new features that don't already exist in the base game. For example, in the Halo mod, you can't jump forward with the energy sword like you could in a base Halo game, because that feature doesn't exist in Contractors. And while modded content does add a lot of variety to these games, it's never going to be the same as an entirely new game, and I think that's really important to understand. Eventually, people are going to want to play a new VR PvP shooter, myself included. But how do we make a VR PvP shooter that doesn't suffer from the exact same problems as these 3 games? Well, I think all we have to do is look at one of my favorite VR single-player shooters, and that's Compound. I really like this game. It's a roguelike shooter where you go through different stages, collecting different weapons, fighting bosses, until you eventually hit the roof to fight the final boss and then do it all over again. It has a progression system where you unlock new weapons and modifiers by completing Steam achievements. This game also runs very, very smoothly on any VR headset out there because of these pretty simple graphics, which I'm sure you've already noticed by now. You would think that graphics this simple wouldn't really work in VR, but it's actually still very immersive in its own weird way. I also think the simple graphics and the setting of the game itself allows the developer to experiment and implement tons of different little mechanics without having to worry about weird hardware restrictions. Oh, and you heard me right, I did say developer. This was developed almost completely by a single guy. I think the VR PvP shooter world can learn a few important lessons from this game. First, and I really want to stress this, not every PvP shooter has to be a modern, realistic, tactical shooter. It blows my mind that pretty much every PvP shooter in VR does the same basic modern Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 setting. Could you imagine how fucking awesome Titanfall 2 in VR would be? Oh my god, using a grapple hook with my right arm while spraying an L-star on my left would be incredible. And don't even get me started on how cool Titans would be. And actually, didn't Respawn make a VR game not too long ago? It's EA, don't get your hopes up. But some of the most popular FPS games right now on PC are ones like Valorant, Apex Legends, and Destiny 2 is actually doing pretty well. So why have there been no PvP shooters in VR with any science fiction themes? I feel like this setting can actually allow you to explore so many cool, unique gameplay elements that would be made even better with VR, while basically ignoring problems like recoil, because you know, sci-fi guns don't have recoil, or movement that isn't exactly tactical or realistic, because again, you're in like space or whatever. You know? Compound is a perfect example of the potential here. When you start to focus on the actual gameplay experiences over things like graphics and realism, I think you would get a much better PvP shooter overall, and a much more successful one too. And it doesn't take a huge studio to pull this off, obviously. Compound was just made by one guy. Now, stuff like multiplayer servers and networking is pretty complicated, and that's going to take more than one person, but you get what I'm saying, it doesn't take a huge AAA studio to pull this off. And you can also sell to every system out there because more simple graphics runs on every system available. Looking at games like Compound, or even Superhot, and the Contractors Clone Wars mod, and the Halo mods, it's clear to me that people want more than just another VR tactical PvP shooter, myself included. These types of games we have now all seem to be suffering from a lack of variety because of the barriers they've put themselves in. And they're turning to community-driven modded content to solve this problem. Maybe in the future, when VR headsets are cheaper and more powerful, we can maybe then get some extremely complex and graphically intensive games. But until then, we have to work with the hardware and the limitations that exist now. And I think the VR PvP shooter genre needs a breath of fresh air badly. Something that's maybe a little more simple in presentation, but a lot more complex in its actual gameplay. Something with real progression that has good game modes and unique gunplay. There are so many opportunities here if you get your head out of the VR tactical shooter mindset, which I'll be honest, it's kind of hard to do considering that's the only type of game on the market right now. On the random chance that somebody watching this video is considering making a PvP VR shooter, please take this into consideration. There's obviously a demand for it, and I think it's a really good idea. Who knows, maybe one day, many years into the future, I might make this sort of game myself, but until then, maybe this video will just slightly push the genre into a better direction. Or maybe I'm just ranting into the void, who knows. In any case, I hope you enjoyed watching this video. It took a lot, and I mean a lot of time to make compared to my normal stuff, and I needed to take a break from making Deadside content, especially right before a big update. That way, when that big update hits, I can really start crunching out content without getting super burnt out. And let me know what you think about my ideas and my criticisms of some games. I don't really see anybody else talking about this genre at all, at least in this way, so I'm interested to see what people think. But thanks for watching. Talk to you guys later. See ya.